The private line buzzed twice before Antonio Siciliani lifted his eyes from the ledger. He sat alone in the marble study of the Siciliani estate, the morning light cutting through centuries-old windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like ghosts of his ancestors. The scent of rain on stone drifted through the half-open door. It was barely 7 a.m., and already his underbosses were waiting in the courtyard below for orders. The phone continued its muted vibration across the oak table. Antonio frowned. This line didn't ring for small problems. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, local, institutional. He almost sent it to voicemail, but instinct, honed by years of calculated paranoia, made him answer. "Siciliani," he said, his voice carrying the weight of blood and old money. "Mr. Siciliani?" The woman's voice was calm, practiced, efficient. "This is Nurse Torres from St. Fernando Hospital. I'm calling about Lisa Morris. You're listed as her emergency contact." Antonio's fingers tightened around the phone. The tattoos on his knuckles flexed. Lisa Morris, his accountant. The quiet woman who balanced blood-stained accounts with a composure so unnerving that even killers lowered their voices around her. Always precise, always present, except this morning. She hadn't sent her usual 6 a.m. report. He'd noticed but dismissed it. "What happened?" he asked, already standing, his chair scraping against marble. "Miss Morris was brought in after collapsing in her apartment. A neighbor called emergency services. She's stable but unconscious. We're running tests to determine the cause." The nurse paused. "Sir, are you family?" "No," Antonio replied, the word tasting strange on his tongue. "I'm her employer." "I see." The silence on the other end held judgment he couldn't quite name. "Well, she has no family listed in her records. You're the only contact we found in her phone." Antonio moved to the window, looking down at the iron gates of his estate, at the guards who would die on his word, at the empire built on silence and fear. Lisa had worked for him for 3 years, managing the labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts that kept his world clean. She knew where every euro of blood money flowed. She was indispensable. Yet he realized, with a sharp edge of something uncomfortably close to shame, that he knew nothing about her beyond those numbers. Not where she lived, not who she loved, not what kept her awake at night. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, he said, ending the call. "Welcome back, my amazing family and friends. If you're hooked in and your heart's ready for another story full of emotion, mystery, and twists, click subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Tomorrow brings another story you'll definitely want to hear. Now, let's get into it." The hospital corridors smelled of disinfectant and dying flowers. Antonio walked through the emergency ward like a wolf in sheep's clothing, his tailored black suit and visible neck tattoos, drawing stares from nurses and families alike. He'd driven himself, dismissing his driver. Whatever this was, it felt too personal for witnesses. At the nurses' station, a woman in green scrubs looked up, recognition flashing briefly across her face before she schooled it into professionalism. Even here, his reputation preceded him. "Mr. Siciliani, I'm Nurse Torres. Thank you for coming." Her voice was careful, measured. "She's in room 247. She led him down a sterile hallway to a private room where Lisa lay motionless beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Her dark hair spread across the pillow, her face pale as the sheets beneath her. Wires snaked from her arms to machines that beeped their steady mechanical reassurance. Without her usual sharp blazer and calculated poise, she looked impossibly small, fragile in a way that made his chest constrict. "What's wrong with her?" he asked from the doorway, unable to cross the threshold. A doctor appeared beside him, tablet in hand. "Dr. Castellano." She introduced herself without offering a handshake. "Smart woman. We're still running comprehensive tests, but initial results show severe anemia, dangerous electrolyte imbalances, and signs of chronic metabolic dysfunction. Her medical history indicates an ongoing condition, polycystic ovary syndrome, complicated by insulin resistance." She studied him with the clinical detachment of someone used to delivering bad news. "Has Miss Morris been under unusual stress recently?" Antonio almost laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. The Rossini territory dispute had consumed months. Late nights, early mornings, constant pressure to stay 3 moves ahead of rivals and law enforcement. Of course, there had been stress, but Lisa never showed it, never faltered. Then he remembered how she'd grown thinner these past months, how her hands had trembled slightly when signing off on the last quarterly report, how she'd stayed later than even him some nights. the glow of her laptop the only light in the accounting wing. He'd seen it all and noticed nothing. "She's been working," he said quietly. "We all have." Dr. Castellano's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Siciliani, this goes beyond work-related exhaustion. PCOS requires careful management. Left untreated under severe stress, complications arise." Was Miss Morris receiving treatment? He stared at the machines, keeping track of Lisa's heartbeat. "I don't know." The admission tasted like ash. Antonio Siciliani knew everything, every judge in his pocket, every shipment crossing the Mediterranean, every debt owed to his family going back 3 generations. But he didn't know if the woman who held his empire together was dying by inches while sitting 10 feet from his office. "Perhaps there's someone else we should call?" Nurse Torres suggested gently. "Family? Friends?" "There's no one," he said. The woman who knew his darkest secrets had marked him a man who ordered deaths over breakfast as the person to call when her life hung in the balance. Why? Antonio moved into the room finally, standing at the foot of Lisa's bed. The machines hummed. The city beyond the window began to wake. And for the first time in his carefully controlled life, the most feared man in Verona had no plan, no order to give, no problem he could eliminate with money or violence. He pulled a chair to her bedside and sat, watching the shallow rise and fall of her chest. 3 years ago, Lisa Morris had walked into his world with a resume that should have made him laugh, and a calm that should have made him suspicious. She'd asked for a job no sane person would take, handling accounts no honest accountant would touch. He'd hired her on instinct, the same instinct that kept him alive in a world where trust was currency more valuable than gold. But now, as dawn broke over St. Fernando Hospital, Antonio began to wonder what he'd missed. Not just in recent weeks, but in every quiet moment she'd worked beside him, every late night she'd stayed without complaint, every smile that never quite reached her eyes. Who was Lisa Morris before she became his accountant? And why would someone so careful about privacy choose him as the one person to call when everything fell apart? The answer lay somewhere in the silence between them. 3 years of professional distance, of numbers exchanged but never stories, of trust built on competence rather than connection. Dr. Castellano returned an hour later with a thicker file and a more somber expression. Antonio hadn't moved from the chair beside Lisa's bed, his suit jacket draped over the armrest, sleeves rolled to his elbows. The tattoos that usually commanded fear seemed out of place here, among beeping machines and sterile white walls. "Mr. Siciliani," the doctor began, pulling up a stool. "We have more comprehensive results now." He straightened, bracing himself the way he did before hearing bad news about shipments or raids. "Miss Morris has polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS. It's a hormonal disorder that affects how the ovaries function." Dr. Castellano's voice was clinical but not unkind. "In her case, it's complicated by insulin resistance, which has led to dangerously low blood sugar episodes. Combined with severe iron deficiency anemia and what appears to be months of chronic stress and inadequate nutrition, her body essentially shut down." Antonio's gaze drifted to Lisa's face. Even unconscious, there was a tightness around her mouth, as if she were still holding something back. "Is it treatable?" he asked. "Yes, with proper medication, dietary changes, stress management, and regular monitoring. But Mr. Siciliani..." The doctor paused, choosing her words carefully. "This didn't happen overnight. Miss Morris has been struggling with this for some time. The question is whether she was receiving care." "She never mentioned being sick," Antonio said, more to himself than the doctor. "Many women with PCOS don't. There's still stigma, misunderstanding. Some push through the pain because they're afraid of being seen as weak or unreliable." "Doctor," Castellano glanced at the monitors. "Are you family? A partner? I need to understand her support system." "I'm her employer," Antonio replied. The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of inadequacy in all directions. The doctor's expression shifted not judgment exactly, but a quiet assessment. "I see. Is there anyone else we should contact? Family members? Friends?" "There's no one," he said again, the repetition making it worse somehow. "Just me." After the doctor left, Antonio sat in the growing morning light and really looked at Lisa for the first time. Not as the efficient accountant who never missed a deadline, but as a person he'd somehow failed to see. Her hands rested atop the thin hospital blanket, small, elegant, but marked with faint scars across her knuckles and fingertips, evidence of a life lived before his ledgers and offshore accounts. Evidence of work, of struggle, of a history he'd never bothered to ask about. She'd sat across from him dozens of times, those same hands turning pages and typing reports, and he'd never once noticed the tremor that must have been there. Never asked if she was well. Never wondered why someone so talented would take a job that came with blood on its margins. His phone vibrated. The estate. He stepped into the hallway to answer. "Where are you?" Marco's voice carried the edge of concern disguised as irritation. As his consigliere, Marco had earned the right to ask questions others wouldn't dare. "Hospital." A pausa. "Are you hurt?" "No, Lisa is." "The accountant?" Confusion, then understanding. "Antonio, the Rossini meeting is in 3 hours. Vito's expecting orders on the port shipment. You need to be here." Antonio pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose, exhaustion settling into his bones. "Handle it." "Handle." Marco stopped himself. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, more careful. "She's an employee, Antonio. A good one, yes, but this isn't. You're the Don. People are watching. If you're at a hospital for what, Marco?" The words came out sharper than intended. "For someone who works for me? For the woman who knows every account, every number, every secret that keeps us ahead of the law? That's not what I meant." But it was. Antonio could hear it in the spaces between Marco's words. In their world, attachments were weaknesses. Caring was currency you couldn't afford to spend. "I'll be back when I'm back," Antonio said and ended the call. He returned to Lisa's room, to the steady rhythm of machines measuring her survival in numbers she would have appreciated. He'd built an empire on control, on knowing every variable, every player, every outcome before it happened. Men feared him because he was always 3 moves ahead, always untouchable. Yet here, in this sterile room with its fluorescent lights and medicinal smell, all his power meant nothing. He couldn't order her body to heal, couldn't threaten her illness into submission, couldn't make the past 3 years of negligence disappear with money or influence. The realization settled over him like winter fog, heavy, cold, inescapable. He thought back to their last meeting, just 2 days ago. She'd presented the quarterly reports with her usual precision, but her hand had trembled slightly when signing the final page. He'd noticed his survival depended on noticing details, but he'd attributed it to the late hour, the pressure of the Rossini situation, nothing more. How many other signs had he dismissed? How many times had she stayed late not out of dedication but because she had nowhere else to go? How many quiet battles had she fought while sitting 10 feet from his office, too proud or too afraid to ask for help? Antonio pulled the chair closer and sat again. This man who could command armies with a word, helpless before the simple fact of human fragility. Outside, the city he controlled continued its rhythm deals made, territories negotiated, power shifting like tides. Inside this room, none of it mattered. For the first time in his carefully constructed life, Antonio Siciliani had no plan, no strategy, no next move. All he could do was wait, and watch, and wonder who Lisa Morris really was beneath the professional mask she'd worn so well, and why saving her suddenly felt more important than protecting his empire. Antonio made the call from the hospital parking lot as the sun climbed higher over Verona. His voice was steady, commanding, though something beneath it had shifted. "Marco, I need you to find out everything about Lisa Morris. Where she came from, who her family was, what she did before us." Silence on the other end, then, "Are you sure that's wise?" "I didn't ask if it was wise." "Understood. How deep do you want us to go?" Antonio watched the morning traffic flow past the hospital gates, ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware of the weight pressing against his chest. All the way back. "I want to know who she was before she walked into my office." By evening, Marco arrived at the estate with a folder that felt too thin for a life's worth of secrets. They met in the study where the phone call had started it all, the room now feeling like a different world entirely. "You're not going to like this," Marco said, setting the folder on the desk between them. Antonio didn't reach for it immediately. "Tell me." Marco exhaled slowly, the way he did when delivering news that couldn't be unsaid. Her father was Nathan Morris. British expatriate, ran a small export business in Verona 25 years ago. It failed. He developed a gambling problem trying to recoup losses. Antonio's jaw tightened. He already knew where this was heading. The Luna Casino. 1998. Marco's voice was clinical, factual. He owed 200,000 euros to the house. Your father's house. The words hung in the air like smoke. Antonio remembered the Luna, his father's pride, a legitimate front that laundered millions while hosting Verona's elite. He'd been 11 years old when it burned down under mysterious circumstances, insurance money funding the family's expansion into shipping. "What happened to the debt?" Antonio asked, though part of him already knew. "Your father forgave it," personally. Marco slid a yellowed ledger page across the desk, his father's handwriting. Sharp and decisive. Debt cancelled. Wife and daughter present. Enough. Antonio stared at the words. His father, for all his ruthlessness, had occasionally shown mercy when witnesses made collection too messy. A wife. A daughter. Where's the father now? Dead. Heart attack. 10 years ago. Died broke. Marco paused. The mother remarried, moved to England. No contact with Lisa since she was 19. So she'd been alone. Building a life from the ruins of her father's mistakes. Brilliant enough to become an accountant. Desperate enough to work for the family that had once held her father's life in their hands. And she'd never said a word. There's more, Marco continued, reluctance creeping into his tone. Lisa doesn't know about the debt cancellation. Based on her records, she believes her father paid it off before he died. She thinks she doesn't owe you anything. But she did. Not in money and blood and history and the cruel poetry of children inheriting their parents' ghosts. Antonio stood abruptly. Where does she live? The apartment building stood in one of Verona's forgotten neighborhoods, wedged between a closed factory and a discount grocery. Faded brick, rusted balconies, the kind of place where people didn't ask questions about their neighbors. Antonio climbed the narrow stairs alone, refusing the men who'd offered to accompany him. This felt too personal for witnesses. The door to apartment 3B was locked, but a call to the landlord and a persuasive tone that brooked no argument produced a key within minutes. The space was smaller than his study. One room serving as bedroom and living area, a kitchenette with a temperamental stove, a bathroom door that didn't close completely, but it was meticulously kept, books organized by size, dishes drying in a neat row, a potted plant struggling toward sunlight on the windowsill. Evidence of someone trying to build dignity from scraps. On the small dining table, really just a desk pressed against the wall, Antonio found the first pile of envelopes. Medical bills, each stamped with red warnings. Final notice. Sent to collections. Payment overdue. He opened one. St. Fernando Hospital, 6 months ago. Laboratory work, diagnostic imaging, 800 euros. Another. Specialist consultation, 400 euros. Another, and another. Each one a piece of suffering she'd hidden behind her professional composure. Beside the bills sat a worn notebook, its cover creased from use. Antonio opened it, recognizing immediately the neat columns of figures, the precise handwriting he'd seen on dozens of reports. But these weren't his accounts. These were corrections. Page after page of calculations, discrepancies she'd found in the organization's laundering operations, errors that could have triggered audits, frozen assets, drawn law enforcement attention, each one meticulously documented, then resolved, with notes on how she'd redistributed funds to cover the gaps. June 12, Cyprus account, 30K discrepancy, Vito's records incorrect, corrected via offshore transfer chain. August 3, Malta Holdings, invoice duplication, potential red flag, restructured under separate entity. September 19, import taxes miscalculated, would have triggered customs review, absorbed into operational costs. Dozens of them. Small fires she'd extinguished before they could spread, protecting the empire without ever demanding recognition or reward. While he'd been issuing orders and expanding territories, she'd been holding the foundation together with her bare hands. Antonio sank into the chair, the notebook open before him. How many times had she sat here, in this cramped apartment, fixing his men's mistakes while her own body betrayed her? How many nights had she chosen his empire's survival over her own health? Near the window, half hidden beneath a stack of books, he found the final piece. Eviction notices. 3 months behind on rent. The landlord's patience wearing thin, legal action pending. She'd been drowning, and he'd never noticed the water rising. Antonio stood slowly, surveying the modest space, the fading wallpaper, the second-hand furniture, the single photograph on the wall showing a younger Lisa with a man who must have been her father, both smiling despite whatever shadows already gathered around them. This was the life of the woman he'd trusted with his empire's secrets. This quiet desperation, this silent pride, this fierce competence built from the ashes of a family destroyed by the same world she'd chosen to serve. The emotion that crashed over him was unfamiliar, uncomfortable, a burning in his chest that no amount of control could extinguish. Shame. Not the performative kind men in his position sometimes displayed for strategic purposes, but real shame. Raw and honest and utterly foreign. He'd built an empire on the backs of people he never saw. Made fortunes while those around him scraped by. demanded loyalty without ever questioning what it cost. Lisa Morris had given him everything, her brilliance, her discretion, her silent protection, and in return, he'd given her nothing but indifference dressed up as employment. Antonio carefully closed the notebook, left the bills where he'd found them, and locked the apartment behind him. But as he descended the stairs into the cooling evening air, he carried the weight of that small room with him. Some debts, he realized, couldn't be forgiven because they could never be fully repaid. Antonio returned to the hospital as dusk settled over Verona, the folder from Lisa's apartment still burning a hole in his consciousness. He found Nurse Torres at the station, her shift nearly ended, fatigue etched into the lines around her eyes. "Mr. Siciliani." She glanced up from her charts. "Miss Morris is stable. No change yet, but that's not unusual. The body needs time." He nodded, something in her expression catching his attention. "But—" She hesitated, the way people did when they weren't sure if speaking would cause more harm than silence. There was something odd in her blood work, the toxicology report. Antonio's entire body went still. What kind of odd? Her insulin levels were erratic, far beyond what we'd expect even with her condition. When we analyzed the medication in her apartment, Nurse Torres lowered her voice. There were inconsistencies, traces of dilution. Someone had tampered with her insulin. The words landed like bullets. Antonio's mind, trained to calculate threats and angles, immediately reconstructed the scenario. Lisa, alone in her apartment, injecting medication she trusted, never knowing it had been compromised. Her body spiraling, blood sugar crashing, until her neighbor found her unconscious. "Are you certain?" His voice was calm, lethally so. "The lab ran it twice. I shouldn't be telling you this patient confidentiality, but you're her emergency contact and—" She met his gaze. "I've worked in this city long enough to recognize your name, Mr. Siciliani. If someone tried to hurt her, I thought you should know. Smart woman. Braver than most." "Thank you," Antonio said, and meant it. The call to Marco was brief, coded in the language they'd developed over years of navigating surveillance and wiretaps. "The accountant's illness wasn't natural. I need eyes on everyone who's had access to her movements in the past 3 months, especially internal." Marco's response was immediate. "I'll have a report by midnight. Make it sooner." Antonio spent the next hours in Lisa's room, his presence a silent vigil while his mind worked through possibilities. Who would benefit from her removal? Who had she threatened simply by doing her job too well? The answer arrived at 10 p.m., delivered by Marco in person. His consigliere's face was grim. "You were right, Vito Morelli." Antonio's hands curled into fists. Vito, one of his underbosses, responsible for port operations and import logistics. A man who'd sworn loyalty on his mother's grave. "Explain." Marco spread documents across the windowsill printouts of encrypted communications, financial transfers to offshore accounts Antonio didn't recognize, timestamps that told a story of systematic theft. He's been skimming for 8 months. Small amounts, routed through fake vendors and inflated shipping costs, smart enough to avoid obvious patterns. Marco tapped one page, but not smart enough to fool her. Antonio's jaw tightened. Lisa found it. More than found it. She documented everything. There's a file on her laptop encrypted, but our tech people cracked it. She'd traced every stolen euro, built a complete case. She was planning to bring it to you. When? 2 weeks ago, according to her calendar notes. But then she got sick. Marco's expression darkened. Vito has a cousin who works at the pharmacy where Lisa filled her prescriptions. Same pharmacy for 3 years. The pieces assembled themselves with brutal clarity. Lisa had discovered the theft. Vito had learned she knew. Rather than face Antonio's judgment, he'd chosen to eliminate the evidence not with a bullet or a knife, methods that would draw immediate suspicion, but with sabotage disguised as illness. A quiet murder for a quiet woman. Where is Vito now? Antonio's voice could have cut glass. At the docks, overseeing tonight's shipment. He doesn't know we're onto him. Antonio stood, rolling his shoulders, feeling the old instincts rise, the cold calculation that had kept him alive in a world where mercy was fatal. But underneath it, something else burned. Fury that had nothing to do with stolen money and everything to do with the woman lying unconscious 3 feet away. Bring him to the estate, quietly. No spectacle, no witnesses, just bring him. Marco nodded, then hesitated. Antonio, the men are talking. You've been here 2 days, missed 3 meetings. Vito's been spreading rumors that the accountant has leverage on you, that she's made you weak. Is that what you think? I think, Marco chose his words carefully. That you're changing the rules. In our world, that's dangerous. Our world, Antonio repeated, looking at Lisa's pale face, at the machines keeping her alive after someone had tried to steal that life away. Our world nearly killed her for having the integrity my own men lack. Maybe the rules need changing. By midnight, Lisa Morris was moved. Not to a different hospital, but to a private wing of St. Fernando reserved for dignitaries and those who could afford absolute discretion. Antonio had paid enough to ensure she occupied the entire floor, her room registered under a name that meant nothing to anyone searching databases. Two of his most trusted men, Luca and Dante, soldiers who'd proven themselves in situations where loyalty mattered more than profit, stood guard outside her door in rotation. No one entered without Antonio's explicit approval. Not doctors, not nurses, not God himself if he came knocking. Word spread through the organization like fever. The Don had lost his edge, gone soft over an accountant, abandoned strategy for sentiment. Let them talk. Antonio had spent 15 years building a reputation on fear and calculation. If protecting one woman who'd never asked for protection cost him that reputation, so be it. He sat beside her bed in the new room, larger, quieter, with a window overlooking Verona's hills rather than parking lots. The machines still beeped their steady rhythm, but something felt different here. Safer. You tried to do the right thing, he said softly to her unconscious form, and my world tried to kill you for it. Outside, the city continued its dance of power and corruption, territory and blood. Inside this room, Antonio Siciliani made a choice that would have been unthinkable 48 hours ago. For the first time in his reign, he wasn't protecting his empire. He was protecting someone who mattered more. Antonio was reviewing Vito's financial records on his phone when the machines changed their rhythm. The steady beep that had become background noise over 3 days shifted faster, irregular, then settling into a new pattern. He looked up. Lisa's fingers twitched against the white sheets. Her eyelids fluttered, fighting against the weight of medication and exhaustion. Antonio set his phone aside, rising slowly from the chair he'd occupied more than his own office these past 70 hours. He didn't call for nurses yet. Something told him she needed a moment before the medical staff descended. Her eyes opened brown, disoriented, searching the unfamiliar ceiling before finally landing on him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Antonio stood beside her bed, sleeves rolled to his elbows, tattoos stark against his forearms in the afternoon light. He'd abandoned his jacket days ago, stopped shaving, let the careful polish of his appearance slip. He barely recognized himself. He certainly didn't recognize the expression on Lisa's face, confusion melting into recognition, then hardening into something that looked dangerously close to fury. Why? Her voice cracked, raw from intubation and days of silence. She swallowed, tried again. Why are you here? The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Not what happened or where am I, but why would a man like him be standing vigil over someone like her? You wrote my name, Antonio said simply, on the emergency contact form. Lisa's gaze drifted to the IV in her arm, the monitors tracking her vitals, the private room that was far too expensive for someone living 3 months behind on rent. Understanding dawned across her features, followed by something that might have been humiliation. That wasn't... She stopped, gathering strength. That wasn't an invitation. No? He moved closer, not touching, just close enough that she had to acknowledge his presence. Then what was it, Lisa? She met his eyes with defiance that would have impressed him if it didn't also break something inside his chest. A formality. They require a name. You were the only person whose number I was certain I remembered correctly. Why mine? Her laugh was bitter, painful. Because you always answer your phone. The honesty of it hit harder than any accusation. Not because she cared for him, not because she trusted him with anything that mattered, but because he was reliable in the only way that counted in her isolated world he picked up when she called about work. She'd listed him as her lifeline because he was professionally dependable, and she had no one else. Antonio felt the words settle into the space between his ribs where shame had already taken residence. Lisa, your medication was tampered with. Someone... Stop. Her hand lifted weakly, a gesture that would have been commanding if she'd had the strength for it. Just stop. You need to know. I need you to leave. Her voice gained force, color rising in her pale cheeks. I don't know what this is. Guilt, obligation, some misguided sense of responsibility, but I don't want it. Someone tried to kill you. And you've suddenly become my protector? She struggled to sit up, wincing as her body protested. I've worked for you for 3 years, Antonio. 3 years of watching you make people disappear, of cleaning money that's covered in God knows whose blood, of pretending I don't understand what the numbers really mean." He started to speak, but she cut him off. "You never asked if I was okay. Never noticed when I missed lunch or stayed until 3 a.m., fixing your men's mistakes. Never wondered why someone would take a job like mine unless they were desperate." Her breath came faster, the monitor beeping its concern. "So don't stand there now, looking at me like I'm something precious you forgot you owned, because I'm not yours to protect." The words stripped him bare, each one a knife finding the gaps in armor he hadn't realized he was wearing. "This is my life," Lisa continued, quieter now but no less fierce. "My illness, my problems, my danger. Not your mission. Not your redemption project. Mine." Antonio absorbed the assault, understanding with absolute clarity that she was right. Everything he'd done, the investigation, the guards, the private room, had been about easing his own guilt, proving to himself he wasn't the villain in her story. But he was. He'd always been. "You're right," he said finally. "About all of it." Something flickered in her expression, surprise maybe, that he wasn't fighting back. "I'll go." He grabbed his jacket from the chair, phone slipping into his pocket. "But the guards stay. Not for me, for Vito Morelli, who tried to murder you because you were good at your job. When you're strong enough to leave, they'll make sure you can." He walked to the door, hand on the handle, before stopping without turning around. "For what it's worth, Lisa, I'm sorry. For not seeing you. For not protecting you when it mattered. For being exactly who you think I am." He left before she could respond, closing the door with a gentleness that felt foreign to hands more accustomed to violence. Nurse Torres found him an hour later, sitting on the floor outside Lisa's room, back against the wall, legs stretched across the corridor. Luca and Dante stood guard at either end, but Antonio had positioned himself directly outside her door like some kind of medieval sentinel. "Mr. Siciliani?" The nurse approached cautiously. "There are chairs in the waiting area." "I'm fine here." "Sir, you can't just—" "I'm not leaving." His voice was quiet but absolute. "She told me to go, so I went. She didn't say how far." Torres studied him, this feared man sitting on hospital linoleum at 9 p.m., staring at floor tiles like they held answers to questions he'd never learned to ask. "She's stable," the nurse offered gently. "Vitals are good. She's going to recover." Antonio nodded but didn't move. "Recover, yes. Forgive, probably never. Trust him again, not a chance in hell. But she would live. And as long as Vito Morelli drew breath, as long as his organization held men who valued profit over loyalty, someone needed to stand between Lisa Morris and the world that had already tried to kill her once. If that someone had to be him, the boss she despised, the employer who'd failed her, the man whose empire had nearly cost her everything, then so be it. He would sit here on this cold floor, guarding something sacred he had no right to protect, for as long as it took. Some debts couldn't be paid, but they could be honored through vigil, through presence, through becoming the answer when no one else had bothered to pick up the phone. Vito Morelli arrived at the Siciliani estate believing he'd been summoned for a routine briefing on port operations. He walked through the iron gates at midnight, past guards who wouldn't meet his eyes, into the stone fortress that had stood for 3 centuries, bearing witness to confessions and consequences. Antonio waited in the wine cellar, his father's favorite place for conversations that required privacy and acoustics that swallowed screams. The walls were thick here, the air cool and heavy with the scent of aging oak barrels and darker histories. "Don Siciliani." Vito's smile was confident, practiced. "I came as soon as Marco called." "Sit." Antonio gestured to the single chair positioned beneath the bare bulb. Something in his tone made Vito's smile falter. He sat, posture still relaxed, but his eyes began calculating exits. Antonio remained standing, hands in his pockets, the picture of casual authority. "Lisa Morris, my accountant. Tell me what you know about her collapse." "Terrible thing," Vito said smoothly. "I heard she was sick. PCOS, wasn't it? My cousin's wife has the same." "Your cousin?" Antonio's voice was soft, lethal. "The one who works at Farmacia Benedetti, where Lisa filled her prescriptions for 3 years." Vito's face went carefully blank. "I'm going to ask you once, Vito, and your answer determines how this ends." Antonio moved closer, into the light. "Did you order someone to tamper with her medication?" The silence stretched. Antonio watched Vito's mind work, weighing lies against evidence he didn't know existed, calculating whether confession or denial offered better survival odds. "She was digging," Vito finally said, abandoning pretense. getting too close to the port accounts. I couldn't have her bringing discrepancies to you. It was nothing personal, just business. Antonio finished the sentence, his tone carrying no inflection. You tried to murder a woman because she was good at her job, because she threatened your theft. I was protecting my interests by poisoning someone under my protection. The words came out like a judge's verdict. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Or did you assume I wouldn't care about an accountant? Vito's confidence finally cracked. Antonio, please. I can make this right. The money I can return. The money? Antonio laughed, a sound devoid of humor. You think this is about money? What happened next took less than 3 minutes. Antonio made a call. Marco appeared with 2 men. Vito's protests echoed off stone walls that had heard it all before. Centuries of pleas from those who'd miscalculated loyalty's price. By the time the sun rose over Verona, Vito Morelli and his cousin had simply ceased to exist. No headlines, no police reports, no witnesses. The port operations would be absorbed by others. The stolen funds irrelevant. The Siciliani method remained unchanged, swift, silent, absolute. But as Antonio watched dawn break from his study window, the familiar satisfaction of justice served felt hollow. He'd killed men before, ordered deaths with the casual efficiency of someone signing documents. Each time had been justified betrayals, threats, violations of codes that held his world together. Each time had reinforced his position, reminded everyone what happened when you crossed the Siciliani family. This time felt different. Vito had deserved what came for him. That wasn't the question troubling Antonio as he stood in the morning light. Verona spread below like a kingdom he no longer recognized. The question was simpler and infinitely more complicated. What did it mean that he'd built a world where Lisa Morris had no choice but to work for the family that had destroyed hers? Where competence was rewarded with isolation and attempted murder? Where the only person she could list as an emergency contact was the architect of her desperation? He'd avenged her, yes. Eliminated the threat. Protected what he'd failed to protect before. But vengeance didn't erase the medical bills in her apartment. Didn't undo 3 years of silent suffering. Didn't change the fact that his father's mercy in canceling her father's debt had been the kind of mercy that left survivors grateful for chains. Antonio found himself walking through the estate as the household stirred to life. Past the guards changing shifts, through gardens his mother had planted before cancer took her, toward the eastern edge of the property where the old chapel stood. His father had kept the chapel for appearances, the Siciliani family maintaining traditions even as they corrupted everything those traditions represented. Antonio rarely entered it. Religion and hypocrisy had always seemed redundant to him. But this morning he pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the cool dimness. Dust motes drifted through stained glass light. The pews sat empty, waiting for congregations that never came. At the altar, a marble crucifix watched with the same indifference Antonio had shown the world for 36 years. He stood in the aisle, surrounded by symbols of redemption he'd never believed in, and felt the full weight of his inheritance. His father had built this empire with vision and violence, had taught Antonio that power required distance, that caring was weakness, that men like them protected the organization above all else. Every lesson had been designed to create the perfect Don, calculating, feared, untouchable. And Antonio had learned those lessons perfectly, built upon his father's foundation with his own innovations, expanded territories, increased profits, commanded respect that bordered on worship. Until a phone call shattered the careful architecture of his indifference. I have built a kingdom of fear, Antonio whispered to the empty chapel, his voice barely audible. And now I don't know what I'm supposed to protect anymore. The words hung in the sacred air. Confession without priest or absolution. He'd protected the organization by eliminating Vito. Would continue protecting it through calculated decisions and strategic violence. That was his role, his purpose, the legacy he'd inherited and honed. But Lisa's face pale against hospital sheets, defiant despite weakness, accusing him of being exactly who he was, haunted him in ways enemy threats never had. She'd survived his world's cruelty through resilience he hadn't earned the right to admire. Had fixed his empire's fractures while her own life splintered. Had listed him as her emergency contact not because she trusted him, but because she had no one else. And that truth, more than any betrayal or threat, exposed the emptiness at the center of everything he'd built. Antonio stood in his father's chapel as morning light transformed the stained glass into colors that promised redemption for the faithful. He wasn't faithful. Wasn't sure he believed in anything beyond power and its consequences. But he believed Lisa Morris deserved better than what his world had given her. Whether he could be better, Whether a man built from blood and calculation could become something resembling human remained an open question. One he'd have to answer from his position on cold hospital floors, standing guard over someone who'd told him to leave, protecting a life his empire had nearly destroyed. Antonio arrived at the hospital on the 5th day to find Lisa sitting upright in bed, dressed in her own clothes, a simple blouse and cardigan someone must have retrieved from her apartment, arguing with Dr. Castellano. "Miss Morris, I understand your frustration, but medically speaking, I'm stable. My levels are normalized and I can manage the rest at home." Lisa's voice carried the steel Antonio recognized from countless financial briefings. "I'm requesting discharge. Against medical advice. Is still my right." Antonio knocked lightly on the doorframe. Both women turned. Dr. Castellano's expression showed relief at the interruption. Lisa's showed something closer to irritation. "Mr. Siciliani," the doctor said, "perhaps you could help me explain." "Could you give us a moment?" Antonio asked quietly. Dr. Castellano glanced between them, reading dynamics she'd probably witnessed 100 times before: powerful men, stubborn patients, outcomes that rarely satisfied anyone. She left with a murmured promise to return in 15 minutes. The door closed. Silence settled like dust. Lisa spoke first. "If you're here to convince me to stay, save your breath. I've already made my decision." "You almost died, Lisa." Antonio remained by the door, giving her space. 5 days ago you were unconscious. Your body was shutting down. And now it's not. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, moving with deliberate care that betrayed lingering weakness. "I appreciate the private room, the guards, whatever guilt-driven gesture this all represents, but I'm done being a project. This isn't about guilt. Isn't it?" She looked at him directly, color returning to her cheeks along with the sharp intelligence he'd relied on for 3 years. "You've been here every day, Marco tells me. Sleeping on floors, missing meetings." The great Antonio Siciliani, playing guardian angel to the accountant he never noticed, was dying. The words landed with surgical precision. "So yes," she continued, "I'm leaving. Going back to my apartment, my life, my problems. You can return to your empire with a clear conscience knowing you did your duty. And yet," Antonio said quietly, moving into the room, "you're still working for the man who built a world that kills people like me with silence." Lisa blinked, thrown by hearing her own accusation reflected back. "That's what you said, isn't it?" He pulled the chair closer, sitting so they were nearly at eye level. "That I built a world where silence is deadly. You're right, I did. But you're about to walk back into that same world, into an apartment you can't afford, with medical bills you can't pay, pretending everything's fine. That's my choice. Is it? Or is it the only choice I've left you?" Antonio leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Your pride won't let you accept help from me because accepting means admitting you need it, and needing anything in my world is weakness. Don't psychoanalyze me." Her voice sharpened, defensive. "You don't know anything about me. I know you fixed my men's mistakes for 8 months without asking for credit or compensation. I know you lived 3 months behind on rent rather than request an advance. I know you listed me as your emergency contact because I was reliable, not because you trusted me with anything that mattered." Lisa's jaw tightened. "I know," Antonio continued, his voice softening, "that you've been alone so long that accepting help feels like surrender, that you'd rather collapse in your apartment again than admit you can't do this by yourself." "Stop." The word came out quieter than she'd intended. "Why? Because I'm getting too close to something real?" He held her gaze. "You see through everyone else, Lisa. You read numbers and find the lies hidden in them. But you think I don't see through you? You see an employee who became inconvenient. I see someone terrified of being vulnerable." Antonio's voice dropped lower, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with recognition. "Someone who learned early that depending on others means getting hurt. That the only person you can trust is yourself, even when that trust is killing you." Lisa's hands gripped the edge of the mattress. "You don't get to do this." "Do what?" "Act like you understand. Like we're the same." But her voice wavered, the armor cracking. "You're the one with power, Antonio. You choose isolation. I just survive it." The honesty stopped him. She was right. His loneliness was cultivated, strategic, a moat around the castle of his authority. Hers was the loneliness of necessity, of circumstances that left her no alternative. Différentes sources. Same result. "You're right," he admitted. "I chose this life. You inherited the consequences of someone else's choices, your father's mistakes, my father's mercy. That wasn't mercy at all." Nothing about that's fair. Life isn't fair. I learned that at 10 when we lost our house. Lisa's defenses were crumbling, exhaustion and medication, and 5 days of forced vulnerability finally taking their toll. So spare me the guilt-ridden confessions. I don't need your pity. Good, because I'm not offering pity. Antonio's voice carried steel now, matching hers. I'm offering honesty. You almost died because someone in my organization decided you were expendable. You worked yourself sick, covering for my empire's corruption. And yes, I was too blind or too indifferent to notice. He stood, pacing to the window. But here's the truth you don't want to hear, Lisa. You're not expendable. Not to the organization. Your work kept us ahead of law enforcement more times than you know, and not to. He paused, searching for words in territory he'd never mapped. Not to me. Antonio, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm not expecting gratitude for doing what I should have done 3 years ago. He turned back to face her. I'm just asking you not to go back to that apartment alone, not to pretend you're fine when you're not to let pride kill you because accepting help from me feels like losing. Lisa stared at him, something shifting in her expression. Why do you care? The question hung between them, simple and devastating. Because, Antonio said slowly, you answered a question I didn't know I was asking. You put my name on that form, and I'm still trying to figure out if I deserve to be the person someone calls when everything falls apart. Silence filled the room, not hostile anymore, but heavy with truths neither had intended to speak. I'm still leaving, Lisa finally said, but the conviction had softened. I know. And I don't want guards following me. Luca and Dante stay. Negotiate something else. She almost smiled. Almost. You're impossible. So are you. Antonio moved toward the door, then stopped. For what it's worth, Lisa, you're the strongest person I've ever met. And I've met people who'd kill you for suggesting they weren't. He left before she could respond, but through the closing door, he heard something that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. In that sterile room, something had shifted. Not forgiveness that would take time, neither was sure they had, but recognition. Understanding. The fragile beginning of truth. The discharge papers took 20 minutes to process. Lisa signed them with steady hands while Antonio waited in the hallway, giving her the illusion of independence even as his car idled outside with Luca at the wheel. Dr. Castellano emerged first, catching Antonio before Lisa appeared. She's stable, but fragile. The medication needs to be taken precisely morning and evening, with food. Any stress could trigger a relapse. Understood. Mr. Siciliani. The doctor's voice dropped. Whatever happened between you two in that room yesterday, it helped. She stopped fighting quite so hard. Sometimes the body can't heal until the spirit stops exhausting itself. Antonio nodded, unsure what to do with the observation. Lisa appeared moments later, dressed in clothes that hung slightly loose, a hospital bag of prescriptions clutched in one hand. She moved carefully, conserving energy, but her spine was straight. Pride, even now. Ready? Antonio asked. I can take a cab. You could, but my car's already here, and arguing about it wastes time you should be spending resting. She studied him, calculating whether this battle was worth fighting, then sighed. Fine, but only because I'm tired. They both knew it was more than that, but neither said so. The drive across Verona was quiet. Luca navigated traffic with professional efficiency, while Lisa watched the city pass the tourists crowding Piazza della Erbe, the merchants setting up flower stalls, life continuing its rhythm oblivious to private catastrophes. Vito's gone, Antonio said halfway through the journey. Lisa's head turned slightly. Gone? He won't be a problem anymore. Neither will anyone else who knew about your situation. She absorbed this, her expression unreadable. Should I ask how gone? Probably not. Did you... She stopped, reconsidering. Never mind. I don't want to know. But she did know. Had known since the day she accepted his job offer what kind of man Antonio Siciliani was, what kind of justice his world dispensed. The difference now was that violence had been deployed on her behalf, and she wasn't sure how that made her feel. Protected? Complicit? Both? The car pulled up outside her building. Antonio moved to get out, but Lisa raised a hand. I can manage the stairs. I'm sure you can. I'm coming anyway. Something in his tone suggested this wasn't negotiable. Lisa was too tired to argue. They climbed the 3 flights slowly, Lisa's breathing labored by the 2nd floor. Antonio stayed 1 step behind, close enough to catch her if needed, far enough to preserve her dignity. At her door, Lisa fumbled with her keys, hands trembling slightly. She got it open, then hesitated on the threshold. Antonio understood why a moment later. The apartment had been transformed. Not redecorated, but restored. The small space still held her second-hand furniture and fading wallpaper, but now it breathed differently. The stacks of medical bills had vanished from the table. Her medications sat arranged in a weekly organizer on the kitchen counter, instructions printed clearly beside them. The eviction notices were gone. Lisa walked in slowly, touching surfaces as if confirming their reality. She opened a drawer where she'd kept overdue rent notices empty, checked the small folder where collection letters had accumulated nothing. "You had no right," she whispered, but there was no anger in it, just exhaustion and something that might have been relief. "I know," Antonio said from the doorway. "My bills, my rent, all of it." She turned to face him. "You think saving me makes you clean?" The question hung in the air, sharp and honest. Antonio stepped into the apartment, closing the door behind him. "No," he answered, meeting her eyes. "It just makes me human again." The simplicity of it seemed to disarm her. She sank into the chair by her table, the same chair where she'd sat night after night fixing his empire's mistakes while her own life crumbled. "I can't owe you, Antonio. Don't you understand that? Owing people like you is how my father destroyed us. You don't owe me anything. Your father's debt was erased 27 years ago. This isn't about debt." He moved closer, voice gentling. "This is about making sure you don't have to choose between medication and rent, between health and pride, between living and surviving." "Why?" The word broke on her lips. "Why does it matter to you?" Antonio crouched beside her chair so they were level, his usual authority dissolved into something raw. "Because for 3 years you held my world together while yours fell apart. Because you were brilliant and loyal and invisible, and I never looked. Because you almost died, and I realized I don't want to live in a kingdom where that's acceptable." Lisa's eyes shone with unshed tears. "You can't save everyone, Antonio. Your world doesn't work that way." "No, but I can start with you." An hour later, after Lisa had rested, and Antonio had ensured she understood the medication schedule, she surprised him by accepting his invitation to see the estate. Not as his employee, but as... What? Neither of them had words for it yet. The drive took 15 minutes. Lisa stayed awake this time, watching Verona's outskirts give way to hills and vineyards, then to the imposing iron gates of the Siciliani property. The estate rose before them, centuries-old stone, testament to generations who'd built power through fear and blood. But in the afternoon light, it looked less like a fortress and more like a monument to loneliness. Antonio led her through the main house, past guards who tried not to stare, into the courtyard where marble fountains had stood since before Italy was unified. "My great-grandfather built this fountain," Antonio said, stopping beside the ornate centerpiece. Water cascaded over marble figures locked in eternal struggle. 3 generations of men stood here making blood oaths, swearing loyalty unto death, sacrificing everything for the family's honor. Lisa traced the fountain's edge with her fingers, listening. "I've stood here 100 times," he continued, voice barely above a whisper. "Made promises, received vows, judged men who broke their word. I thought I understood what protection meant, defending territory, eliminating threats, maintaining power." He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw something she'd never witnessed in 3 years of working for him: uncertainty. "But I don't know how to protect the right people, Lisa. I've spent my entire life guarding an empire, and I let the one person holding it together collapse from neglect." His voice roughened. "I want to start now, learning, being better than what I was built to be." The courtyard fell silent, except for the fountain's steady murmur. Lisa didn't respond with words, but when she looked at him, really looked, past the tattoos and reputation and carefully constructed armor, her expression held something softer than forgiveness. Not absolution. Not yet. Maybe never. But recognition. Understanding. The tentative beginning of belief that people could choose to become more than their inheritance demanded. In that ancient courtyard, under the weight of generations who'd valued power over humanity, something fragile and new took root. 6 weeks after the hospital, Lisa Morris walked the stone paths of the Siciliani estate under her own power. Antonio watched from the study window as she moved through the courtyard, her pace measured but steady. She'd regained weight, color returning to her face like spring after a brutal winter. The medications worked, the rest helped, but more than that, she'd stopped fighting her own recovery as if survival were a weakness to overcome. The estate had changed too, in subtle ways that probably meant nothing to anyone else. The vines climbing the eastern wall had bloomed clematis that hadn't flowered in Antonio's memory, suddenly erupting in purple clusters. The gardener claimed he'd done nothing different, but Antonio took it as the kind of sign his mother would have believed in, beauty returning where it had been dormant. Lisa noticed him watching and waved, a casual gesture that would have been impossible weeks ago, when every interaction carried the weight of unpaid debts and unspoken accusations. He raised his hand in return, then descended the stairs to join her. "The doctor cleared you for exercise?" he asked as she approached the fountain. "Light walking, nothing strenuous." She touched one of the flowering vines. "When did these bloom?" "2 weeks ago. Marco thinks it's the weather." "And you?" Antonio smiled slightly. "I think the estate was waiting for something worth celebrating." She rolled her eyes, but the gesture was affectionate rather than dismissive. They'd found an equilibrium in recent weeks, not quite friendship, not employer and employee anymore. Something undefined that worked precisely because neither tried to name it. Lisa had returned to work part-time, setting her own hours, focusing on strategic analysis rather than the daily grind that had consumed her before. Antonio had hired 2 additional accountants to share the load, both thoroughly vetted and paid enough that desperation wouldn't tempt them toward Vito's mistakes. She still lived in her apartment, though Antonio had quietly arranged for the building's new owner, a shell company he controlled, to offer her a long-term lease at a rate that wouldn't insult her pride. She'd accepted after confirming the offer extended to other tenants, not just her. Small compromises, careful respect for the boundaries she needed. "I got a strange letter yesterday," Lisa said, settling on the fountain's edge, "from something called the Lisa Fund." Antonio's expression remained neutral, but internally he braced himself. "A medical initiative," she continued, pulling the letter from her pocket, "providing free PCOS treatment, medication assistance, and support groups for women in low-income communities across Verona and Venice." She looked up at him. "Funded by anonymous donors through charitable fronts that look suspiciously like shell companies I've seen before." He said nothing, waiting. "The Lisa Fund, Antonio. They named it after me." "Did they?" He sat beside her, maintaining the pretense poorly. "Don't." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Don't play innocent. I recognize your organizational structure, the funding mechanisms. This has your fingerprints all over it." Antonio leaned back, letting the afternoon sun warm his face. "You said once that I built a world that kills people with silence. You were right. But I've been thinking if I built one kind of world, maybe I can build another, or at least contribute to one that does less harm. So you created a medical fund. I created a way for women like you not to choose between rent and insulin, not to work themselves into collapse because treatment isn't affordable, not to suffer alone because no one's paying attention." He met her eyes. "The fund helps about 200 women so far. That number will grow." Lisa studied the letter, emotions playing across her face: surprise, gratitude, something that might have been grief for the years she'd suffered without such help existing. "Why my name?" she asked quietly. "Because you reminded me that some things are worth saving." The words settled between them like stones in still water, creating ripples that reached shores neither had anticipated. "Antonio," her voice caught, "you don't have to say anything. It's not about gratitude or debt or evening scores." He stood, offering his hand. "Come on, there's something I want to show you." She took his hand, warm, solid, grounding, and let him lead her through the courtyard to the villa's eastern balcony. The balcony overlooked Verona as dusk transformed the city into something between day and night, reality and dream. The hills rolled toward the horizon, vineyards giving way to urban sprawl, then to the distant mountains that had witnessed centuries of the Siciliani family's rise. Lisa leaned against the stone railing, breathing in the evening air. Antonio stood beside her, close enough for presence, far enough for space. No guards watching from doorways. No protocols or hierarchies. Just 2 people who'd been broken by silence and saved by a phone call neither had wanted. "I never thanked you," Lisa said after a long moment. "For coming to the hospital. For staying. For..." She gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that had changed. "All of it. You don't need to thank me for doing what should have been done from the start. Maybe. But I'm doing it anyway." She turned to face him. "You could have left me there, Antonio. Let the hospital handle it. Sent a check. Moved on. That's what most men in your position would have done." "I'm not most men." "No," she smiled. "You're really not." The city lights began flickering on below them, constellations of human life carrying on with their small dramas, unaware that on this balcony overlooking their world, 2 people were rewriting the rules they'd been given. I spent my whole life, Antonio said quietly, learning to be what my father was: strong, feared, untouchable. He taught me that caring was currency you couldn't afford, that power required distance, that protection meant eliminating threats before they materialized. He paused, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. But he was wrong. Redemption doesn't come from fear. It comes from caring enough to answer when someone calls, from seeing the people you've overlooked, from choosing humanity over inheritance. Lisa's hand found his on the railing, a simple touch that would have been impossible weeks ago, revolutionary in its ordinariness. "That phone call," she said softly, "when the nurse told you I'd listed you as my emergency contact. Did you hesitate before coming?" Antonio thought back to that morning, the ledger open before him, the caller ID showing an unfamiliar number, the moment of decision that had changed everything. For about 3 seconds, then instinct took over. Good instinct. The best I've ever had. They stood together as darkness settled over Verona, over the estate that had witnessed generations of blood oaths and power plays, over two people who'd found in each other's brokenness the possibility of becoming whole. For the first time in his life, Antonio Siciliani understood that the most dangerous call wasn't the one that threatened his empire. It was the one that changed everything, by reminding him what empires were supposed to protect. Not territory, not power, not legacy, but the fragile, resilient, irreplaceable human beings who held them together. And that's where today's journey comes to a close. If it spoke to your heart or reminded you of something real, please subscribe, like, and share your reflections in the comments. Your voice keeps this storytelling family alive. Until next time, stay gentle, stay grateful, and keep believing in better days.